to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians discuss depictions of Amish, Mennonite, and other plain groups in pop culture. I'm Tilly, your moderator for this episode, and with me, in the same room, are my co-hosts, Abby and Aaron. This episode, we will be discussing the card game The Mennonite Game, created by Mark S. Hirschberger, and also the informal Mennonite Game on which it is based, where Mennonites who have just met each other desperately try to figure out how they are connected. Our opener question for this episode is about card games, because we are talking about a card game. So, Abby, what's your favorite card game?
Well, sadly, I have been taking a unintentional approximately 3-year break from games, but in the past, I was a very big fan of the card game Tai Chu, which is a 4-person game. It kind of pulls from a number of different other card games. It's slightly politically incorrect in that it appears to be based in Chinese culture, but I think was created by a German board game company. But it's a lot of fun, and it's a partner game. I have played it a lot over the past decade, but not as much in the last 3 years.
I don't know that one. Mm-hmm. For me, two standouts are Sushi Go, which is a very fun, pass cards around type game where you collect little, very adorably drawn bits of sushi and sashimi and mochi and other things. And yeah, it's really cute. The art alone is just adorable and worth playing. It's also just really simple, and you can play with a wide variety of ages, and people who've never played it before can pick it up really easily. And then I believe we will do an entire episode on Dutch Blitz at some point, but I feel like it needs a little shout out here in the favorite games, though I have kind of I have a mixed relationship with Dutch Blitz where I really like it, and not to brag, I'm very good at it, but I get really wound up about it to the point where I sometimes don't let myself play because I just get a little too competitive, and yeah, my insides start to shake when I
And actually, I remember a specific example of this because I was just reminded of the time when I think all three of us were at our coworker Eric's. Mm-hmm. Eric and Debbie got married, and at their reception, the coworker table, they had provided Dutch Blitz games at the reception, which was genius. But I think we were probably the table that got into it the most. We're playing quite competitively. Hopefully we didn't embarrass Eric too much, so...
if I recall, you, Abby, were pretty worthy competition.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I'm very similar. I also get very wound up and very into it. It's a little disturbing.
I get into it, but I am not good. So I just acknowledge that I'm going to get my hand slapped a lot, and I will probably lose. So I think as far as card games go, besides things like old standbys like Euchre, I'm going to have to go with Moms, which is a game that was invented by one of Erin's students' sisters, I think.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And she mentioned it at a library meeting, and later that same day we decided we would create our own deck for Moms. It's a build your own. What you do is you take the descriptive cards from Apples to Apples, and you use those, but instead of playing other nouns on them from the Apples to Apples deck, you replace them with pictures of moms or women that you have cut out from magazines, and you try and determine which woman that has been laid down on the card. I don't know, what's a good example? Fastidious.
Yeah.
What the best visual representation of that is. And so we went maybe a little too far when we created these decks. We ended up laminating them and using a label maker to give them all names.
Which was the best part.
And I still have deck at work, and it comes out occasionally.
Yeah. I will say it's mostly hilarious because of the horrible way that advertising treats women. Basically, it's a fun way of taking the patriarchy and getting a little silver lining of fun out of it, because thanks to the way that women are portrayed, you have some really interesting pictures, and you can have a lot of fun with it.
Well, and to tie it to the topic of this episode, I'm pretty sure when we were trying to brainstorm names, we'd be like, okay, what was your first grade Sunday school teacher?
Yes.
What's your great-grandma's name and all of her siblings?
Yeah.
Yes.
So definitely, if you ever play with us, you will probably recognize the names of family members that have been interspersed along with other names that we made up or just pulled from a hat.
Mm-hmm.
So, moms, make your own. All right. So let's start with the Mennonite game, not the card game or even any real game, but the thing that Mennonites of particular backgrounds do when they will talk to you until they have found a connection or 2 or 5 or 10 about how you are related or who you know in common. I thought we could start with examples of instances where we have played the Mennonite game successfully or with particularly interesting results to show people who may not know what it's like. Erin, why don't you start?
Sure. Not that this is a game that you can win,
But you would like to try.
perhaps. I feel like this happened to me about 10 years ago, and it still just blows my mind that this happened. So I was living here in Indy, and my husband and I had just gotten married, and we were in the downtown Indianapolis area. Like, we had plans that evening, but we had like an hour to kill, and we were walking down the street and we saw Global Gifts. So we popped in, and the very nice woman at the door greets us, and I say, hey, we have some 10,000 Villages gift cards. Can we use those here? She's like, no, sorry, even though they're similar, they're not the same store. But where are you from that you have a 10,000 Villages? And I was like, oh, well, we live here in Indy now, but we're in Goshen for a while. And so the person working there was clearly Mennonite, and then she and I had this like back and forth of like, well, maybe someone in Goshen we know in common. No, we hadn't been going to church in Indianapolis at that point, so that wasn't it. And then finally, I think she said her last name, and it was Swartzendruber, and I was like, oh, do you have Iowa connections? And then, then the floodgates were unleashed. And so then we had a little more back and forth, and it turns out she had been in Iowa just a couple weeks previous and had actually met my grandpa. And my grandpa at that point was very concerned that Matt and I were not regularly attending church and, thought we should be more connected with the Mennonites. So he actually gave this woman who I had never met before my number. And this version of the Mennonite game ended with her being like, wait, are you Erin? And pulling out her phone. Like, she had my number in my phone, this woman I had never met before.
Oh.
And yeah, it was a little mind-blowing. But just sort of an example of how, and it turns out she'd actually gone to high school with my mom. She knew my whole family, but I had never met her.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, one of the things, I guess my portion of the Mennonite story for this instance is that when we started the podcast, I just sort of assumed that I am related to both Erin and Abby somehow. And it wasn't until a little later, with the help of Joe Springer, that I pinpointed how I am related to Erin. Turns out we are fourth cousins. We share a great-great-great-grandparent, set of great-great-grandparents, John F. and Magdalena Miller from Holmes County, Ohio. And so that's a pretty straightforward example of Mennonite game. Mm-hmm. Shared relatives distantly back that we don't know, but I know we overlap in, a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And it's also probably worth saying that it is a running joke among many Mennonites that we are our own, whatever cousin. I am my own sixth cousin. Sometimes I would jokingly refer to my brothers as my sixth cousins.
Yeah.
Just because I could. So, it happens.
Yeah. And despite being essentially unrelated to both of you, you did agree to podcast with me, which is a good sign.
I did.
Yeah.
I'm sure we are related to you. We just need to solicit Joe Springer.
I will say in the Napster, it's probably through the my Hess side is very rooted in Lancaster County. It goes back quite far. The Napster is slightly more recent than that, and also has some Canadian connections. So that might be with you potentially, Tilly, as I point at you.
Because we can do that because we're in person.
Yeah. So my story is a bit of a variation on the game, but has kind of the odd global connection angle. So during my freshman year at Goshen College, I was in Colombia for a May term called Doing Theology Abroad. We were in Bogota, and which was an amazing experience. So we had host families. So I was with my host family in the evening. We had roommates. So my roommate and I were there. We were just kind of relaxing, probably going to go to bed pretty soon because everything was exhausting in that new way. And I was sitting there, and a guest stopped by and just kind of came in, and he came in, and I just was staring at him because it was just this weird out of body, could not figure out who he was, but I knew he was connected to me, and it took me like way too long to realize it was Dwayne, my cousin, first cousin, mind you, who was there he was there on a delegation through CPT, and I think he had known that I think he had talked to my mom or something and had some connection. He knew that I was going to be there, so he had found out where I was staying and made the connection. But it was just so fun, and there was something about having that personal connection during a 3-week period that was so much new and so much unknown and so much overwhelmed, and to have someone that I knew and could barely actually recognize in the moment appear was just this amazing thing. I think I actually almost like cried because it was just like a piece of home has appeared out of nowhere spontaneously in the living room of my host family. Yeah, so I have a very fond memory of that.
Moving on in our discussion, I think it's important to note that while the Mennonite game is a natural way to form connections, it also can be exclusionary to people who are new to the Mennonite church or who come from different backgrounds within the Mennonite church. Mennonite can be a cultural identity for some people, and for others it's a religion-only decision. And we aren't really going to get into that this episode because it's a fairly complex issue, but I think it's fair to say that any name can be a Mennonite name if you are a Mennonite, and many people with traditionally Mennonite names are no longer religiously Mennonite. That being said, let's talk about what the upsides and downsides of the Mennonite game are. Abby, would you start with this one?
Yeah, so I think as you kind of alluded to, I really feel like the upsides and the downsides to this game are very directly connected. Like I kind of was relating a little bit in my story, playing the Mennonite game gives me a sense of belonging, connection, this idea that I'm part of a larger network. But the downside is when you are on the outside of that network, it can be excluding and disconnecting. I think what can even be a little bit more insidious is the way that the Mennonite game can in some ways be a network of kind of an invisible network of privileges for the people who play it. And I know something I work on is trying to be aware of the ways in which I have gained privilege from playing this Mennonite game. Like, I think an example of that is when my husband and I were looking to buy a home in Goshen. It was kind of a seller's market, so it was hard to find good options. And we actually ended up buying a house. It didn't even make it onto the market. We bought it directly from the owners. We found out because our parents were actually in small group with their parents. So now, we paid, I feel a fair price. I feel like we both made a good deal, but if there was literally we had that opportunity because of this network. And it was wonderful for us, but I do think about it in terms of what it would have been like to move to Goshen and try to find housing without that network of Mennonite and Mennonite tangential connections.
Yeah, my thoughts are very similar. Like when Matt and I were moving to Indianapolis from Goshen, we just, due to the logistics of work and school and starting new jobs, and we weren't moving that far, but 3 hours away, we had to find a place for Matt to stay temporarily. And I tried with some people I knew from grad school. Those sort of were dead ends. And so the next step was, well, do we know any Mennonites in Indianapolis? And sure enough, we got connected to actually Tilly's friend's mom, who is now a good friend of Matt and I's and listens to the podcast. Hi, Marie. And she got us connected to a couple at First Menno Indy who had extra space, and that's where Matt ended up staying for 4 months. And so, on the one hand, it's sort of like glorified networking that can be really advantageous when you are in need of help. But on the other hand, now that my last name is not Mennonite, I've sort of felt or not traditionally Mennonite, I've sort of felt the flip side of that. Like if I'm in a sort of Mennonite context and I introduce myself as Erin Milanese, I get a lot of, huh? What's interesting is sort of the blank look that elicits. It's like, I don't know what to ask you about where you're from because I can't place your last name. So often I'll volunteer additional information. But I will say I sort of now try to resist playing it, and it's really hard. But recently I was doing something at IUPUI, the Indiana University branch here in Indianapolis, and the person helping me was a Hostetler, and I was like, I'm not going to say anything. But then he saw my CV, and he saw Goshen College, and he brought it up, and that made it okay. But anymore, like, I try to not just assume based on people's last names that they're going to want to engage in that game. But it is tricky. Yeah.
I generally like playing the Mennonite game. I think of it kind of as just a more strange version of like finding your Kevin Bacon number, but for people without Hollywood connections. I do think there are some definite downsides. One, it's boring to a good number of people, and you'll be sitting around and everyone will be enthusiastically reciting their family tree, and you'll look over and somewhere in a corner there's someone with glazed eyes, like, get me out of here. And then it also, as we sort of hinted at before, gives a bit of an unnecessary name to something that I think all people do, whether they're Mennonite or not, which is just networking. Mm-hmm. And, people in small towns recognize other people who live in the same region, and people who attend the same university try and find out if they overlapped or they had common friends. And I think that the defining feature of the Mennonite game that makes it so catchy and so interesting for us to play is that Mennonites are a large enough group that we have a presence throughout North America, but small enough that there might only be a few people in each of the big cities. So the chances are, if you're in a new place and you meet someone with a traditional name, Swiss German name, or you're hooked up through a friend or something, that you can find those connections really easily. And then it becomes, instinctual. Like, I can't count how many times I've walked into a friend's house and been like, oh, that mug looks familiar. Is it by this Potter? That Potter went to school with my parents. Or like, oh, that artwork looks familiar. I think that, I probably lived in college housing with the brother of the person who did that artwork. And so, mostly you don't get benefits out of some of those interactions, but there definitely are benefits like traveling. Like, I once stayed in Edinburgh with a college friend's aunt's college roommate.
Whoa.
And we had a great time. It was so worth it. Like, we didn't pay for lodging. They made sure we had good food. Like, they fed us haggis so that we could say that we had eaten haggis. They went hiking with us. They sent me a Christmas card after. It was really nice to have that connection and to know that we could reach out to them and that they wouldn't be like, who are you? Why are you reaching out to us? It was like, oh, yeah, this makes some level of sense. Like, this is how people behave. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to balance, when to play it and when to take advantage of it with, like, when it's just totally unnecessary. So I'm going to try and be more intentional about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Moving on to the actual game, it was a Kickstarter-funded game of connections. You use these cards as currency to buy connections and fill a family tree, or I guess a connections tree, because it's not all family. Mm-hmm. And there are these like event cards like potluck and church retreat and things that you play that change the way that the game is played or give you a certain advantage. And then you're supposed to have 10 connections on your tree, and if you get 10 connections, you win. Mm-hmm. So we played a game of this last night to refresh ourselves and found that it was pretty quick and easy to play and easy to pick up. What did you think of it, Abby?
Well, I think it's fitting to begin a discussion of the game, the Mennonite Game, by playing a little Mennonite game with its creator. So, as you said earlier, this was created by Mark Esch Hirschberger. And while I don't know Mark personally, his wife is the younger sister of someone I went to high school with. So, and I also, I'm pretty sure during that, when I referenced that house hunt in Goshen, I am fairly certain that we toured their house because they were selling it around the time we were looking. Mm-hmm. So, lots of connections.
Yeah. Erin, what did you think?
I also don't know Mark, but my brother went to college with him. I don't know if they graduated together. Just to throw in my own little twist on the game there. I think they were at Goshen College at the same time. Anywho, yeah, playing it last night was fun. It's pretty simple, so the sort of game that you could get out at Christmas and you could teach everyone to play very quickly. But it's also kind of a novelty item, so there's not a ton of, like, after you've played it a few times and sort of laughed at the cards and the various insider jokes, I don't know, you might not play it a whole lot after that. But it's a fun game. The best part for me is the event cards. So Tilly already mentioned like the potluck card. So what happens if you play the potluck card is that everyone else playing the game has to lay out a card face up, and then you, as the person who laid the potluck card, get to take two, and then it goes around clockwise and everyone gets to choose one except for the person who's last, because just like in a potluck, if you arrive too late, all the good food may have run out and you don't get anything. So there's just lots of little things like that which I think are fun and make the game fun and funny to play. There are a lot of insider jokes, so I think the game is probably more fun to play if you grew up Mennonite or understand a lot of those inside jokes. So again, those sort of made it fun for us to play. I'm not sure how well it translates to people who might not get all of those jokes.
My favorite inside joke is in the instructions, where if you have a disagreement about the rules, which happens with card games, it says that you're supposed to come to a consensus using a consensus model, and then they said if that fails, you should ask for help from your local pastor. So I felt like I really liked that.
I liked the Upside Down Kingdom as a card, which is a theological stance that very Anabaptist. I sort of giggled with that one. Yeah, I'm not enough of a card game connoisseur, I guess, to critique the gameplay or anything, but I will say that one of the things I did enjoy about this game is that the illustrations are really fun. Mark did the illustrations himself, and they sort of balance like cartoonish, goofy attitude, but they're also stylistic, and the graphic design is nice. It's simple, it's clear to interpret. When you've got things laid out on the table, it's always clear what cards are what. Like, the cards were produced pretty well. You know, it's not like the kind of thing that you would print out from your own printer. They were actually, well printed and really nice. So,
And did you check, is the game still available? Should anyone listening want to purchase?
I do not believe it is. There was an expansion to the Kickstarter that ran. I don't know that they have any of those left. And when I looked at the Kickstarter page, it had closed out. So I don't know if there'll be another run in the future or not. It might have just been a limited run thing.
You can always come to the Goshen College Library and play it there.
Yes, you can check it out. We have it circulating. You know, aside from the card game, the Mennonite Game, there are also other ways that this has been adapted by the Mennonite community. I recall attending a Mennonite convention once where someone had tried to give the Mennonite Game point values. And so, like, if you were directly related to someone, and you could count each connection in a family tree as like an extra point. But if you were connected through like a friendship banner, the points were counted differently, and then you could amass points, and I guess whoever had the most points out of a group of people won. I know there's also a sort of humorous choral song barbershop quartet that you can listen to on YouTube, and we'll link to probably in our promo for this, that is a sung version of the Mennonite Game, pretty much how it's played. Like, if you're going to a church where you haven't been to before, it'll basically, it's the conversations verbatim. And also, to an extent, the Mennonite Game, if you're paying attention to our social media feeds, has definitely been played in our social media feeds. There are people who are like, oh, I know Tilly from college, or, in the case of my mother, I'm Tilly's mother. But there's also people who find out the family connections that are a little bit more distant, or say that they went to school with our siblings, that sort of thing. So you can see this play out in real time if you look there, and you can hear it play out in real time at pretty much any coffee hour at any Mennonite church. I guess that brings us to our reviews. Let's review the intangible Mennonite Game rather than the card game Mennonite Game. On a scale of 1 to 5 third cousins once removed, how many third cousins once removed would you give this, Abby?
Yeah, it is hard. I feel like, as we kind of discussed, it has its pros and cons. I mean, I have quite enjoyed it. Like, I feel like at its best, it's a way of finding people to support you and to also you can then help support. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I feel like the more we do to try to make sure that isn't just other cradle Mennonites, ethnic Mennonites, whatever you want to associate, as long as we try to be aware of the way that that brings privilege and the ways that it can exclude, I think it can be a really wonderful thing, but just something we need to be mindful of. So I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 third cousins once removed.
Yeah, I think I'm the same as I was thinking about this. I think, I pretty much just want to say what Abby said. No, I think it overall can be a tool that just helps us feel a sense of belonging, and where it can be a problem is when it instead has the opposite effect, where people feel excluded because they don't belong. And I mean, I do feel it's important for us to recognize as part of this that we are 3 people who can play this game very proficiently because of how we grew up. So it's hard for us to rate it, I think, because, I mean, I can say that I felt it a little bit with my new last name, but I don't think I at all understand what it's like to be a person of color in the Mennonite church, or really be someone who hasn't grown up with those connections. So yeah, I might go let's go 3.5 third cousins once removed, because overall my experience with it is something fun that I enjoy. We just have to be careful of excluding people.
Yeah, down to what you two said, I would probably also go maybe 4 third cousins once removed for my rating. I think for me, personally, the worst I've experienced with the Mennonite game is that sometimes I'm bored, or sometimes you find a connection and then nothing matters. You're just like, oh, you know my grandma, cool.
Or have you ever been in the room when 2 grandpas start playing the Mennonite?
And then you can definitely mentally check out. Like sometimes it's really fun if you're in a new city or a new place, but sometimes you're in like the same town and you're like, of course we know each other. Like no particular valuable interaction is going to come from this. It will just be a laundry list of family and friends, and we don't need that. But yeah, like you said, just because it can be boring or can get to a point where it doesn't lead to anything particularly fruitful doesn't mean that it's not still exclusionary. So yeah, that prevents it from getting that final star. Sorry, that final third cousin.
And to be fair, in real life we probably all have hundreds, thousands of actual third cousins once removed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening to this week's episode on the Mennonite Game, or Mennonite Games, I suppose. We would love to hear your thoughts on the card game or the concept, as well as any recommendations, corrections, and other musings you might have for us. You can reach us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at plainwrongpod, or through email at plainwrongpod@gmail.com. We always appreciate when people leave reviews and subscribe, as that's how other people learn about the podcast. Thanks for tuning in.